Hello everybody and welcome to the Cold War. Yeah, that's right, I'm finally doing it after all your questions. Snow versus ice. Hold on guys, 1 second, let me take this. Yo, what's up? Karen? Karen! I told you this 1,000,000 times. Why are you telling me now? Oh, come on. Hey, we're talking about this guy, Lenin. He did a lot of things. One specific thing he did was this. Welcome back to Europe. It's 1917, and our guy Lenin, he is in Switzerland. He wants to get back to Russia, so he gets on a train and he heads back to Russia. Now, when he gets back to Russia, he wants to start an internal crisis. He does. He starts a revolution, takes over the country, leaves World War I, and then he turns the country communist, starts a 3-year civil war, and then he breaks the economy. After that, he died, and when he died, he did not want Stalin to become the leader, but he did anyways, and Stalin introduced his 5-year plan, which basically turned the Russian economy from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy. Then this silly guy with a silly mustache tried to take over the world.
Hey guys, so I just lost the Battle of Britain. I don't know what I should do. I think I'm gonna invade Russia, yeah. Invading Russia is the best bet right now.
Hitler would push all the way back to Moscow, and Stalin would push all the way back to Berlin. And the Battle of Berlin would end up pretty much going like this.
FBI, open up!
After the Battle of Berlin, Berlin was completely destroyed. Things were set on fire, buildings were destroyed, everything was gone. Anyways, the 3 major Allied leaders met in Berlin, and they had to decide on what to do with Japan. Luckily, Harry S. Truman had an idea. Yeah, his idea was nuking 2 cities in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then they did it. And then the second one? After that, the Soviet Union was pretty tense about the US now having a nuclear weapon. Anyways, back in Europe, the 3 superpowers were still deciding on what to do with Germany. What they ended up deciding on was this: a Germany split up into 4 parts owned by the 4 powers, and Berlin was also split up into 4 parts owned by the 4 powers. Now, the difference between this and the entire country was that Berlin was over 100 miles within the Soviet sector of Germany, which meant that the Soviets had full control over what came in and out of Berlin. Elsewhere in Europe, people were still struggling from the destruction that World War II left on them. But Stalin, that guy, had a plan for that. It was, if they suffer, the more likely it is they'll turn to communism. But Mr. Truman had 2 plans just for that. And they were the Truman Doctrine, which said these guys are mean, and if they invade you, we'll help you out. Just hopefully you don't attack us in 2001. And then the second one was the Marshall Plan, which basically gave a bunch of European countries a bunch of money, except for Eastern ones and fascist ones. Now, Stalin was pretty angry about all this money that the Americans were throwing at them, so he created the Eastern Bloc, along with Eastern Germany. The West struck back with West Germany. Anyways, remember how Berlin was 100 miles within East Germany? Well, Stalin had a plan for that, and he was going to block travel through East Germany into Berlin. Luckily, the Allies got around this by, instead of using cars to get to Berlin, they used planes to get to Berlin and flew the supplies in. And another true sign of American power was the candy bomber, which dropped candy to the children of Berlin. Back home in America, Mr. Truman was scared of Stalin's forcive actions, but not as much as this. Yeah, the Soviets had invented their own nuclear weapon. Luckily, people felt more comfortable when Stalin came out and said that war with the West is unlikely. Oh wait, no, he said it was inevitable, which only made things worse. After this, the US felt like things couldn't get any worse, so they checked in on their friend China, and they were not doing too well. China had suffered from a 22-year-long civil war in which the People's Liberation Party had taken over mainland
China
and set up the PRC. And after this, America felt like things truly could not get any worse. But oh, things were just getting started. Cause Korea was just split into two, a communist north and an anti-communist south. Both led by very mean, very evil dictators ready to kill each other at first sight. But now that finally the Soviets had the nuke, Kim Il-sung was ready to invade South Korea.
3 days later.
That's right, it only took the Soviets 3 days to take South Korea's capital, and then push them all the way back down to Busan. So the UN finally decided to send in the troops, and this is how that went. Yeah, they pushed them all the way back up to the northern border. Now China felt like the UN was just gonna keep going right into China. Now while that was happening, Douglas MacArthur kept telling Harry S. Truman that the Chinese were not gonna get involved. Meanwhile, 500,000 Chinese troops were crossing into North Korea. Then MacArthur suggested nuking the Chinese, and he was fired. After that, the Korean War would slowly reach a stalemate. Back in the US, they wanted to elect someone that would be tough on communism, and they elected World War II veteran Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's 1953, and Stalin's dead. The new leader of the Soviet Union would be Nikita Khrushchev, who would immediately take an anti-Stalin campaign through de-Stalinization, renaming towns and taking down statues of Stalin. But also during the 50s, spying increased between these two. For example, in the US, Soviet spies were everywhere. In US government, police, they also would have worked at your local pizza parlor or be a teacher in your school. Dang, imagine having a Soviet spy as your teacher. They also set up intelligence agencies. The US had the CIA.
Excuse me, sir.
Huh?
What did you do?
Where am
You're at the CIA headquarters. What did you do?
I? I didn't do anything.
What did you do?
I didn't do anything.
I already know you did something. You were selling US information to the Soviets. I know you did that. You cannot lie about that because
No.
this is liable. We're going to put you in federal prison.
Actually,
We're going to put you in federal prison. You told them about our failed rocket into space.
no, I didn't.
Yes, you did.
I think
You
you have
did.
the wrong person, sir.
No, we have not. No, we have not, because we know you've been selling it. You also told them about the...
Doesn't the CIA have a dress code?
No. I'm
Are you
CIA.
sure? Because you're sure you missed a button.
No, I don't care. Anyways,
Uh-huh. What evidence?
this is the evidence.
Oh, yeah, a tape player. What does that do?
Hold on.
Yeah, that's doing a lot, sir.
There's no tape.
So you have no evidence?
Hold on.
Yeah, no evidence.
It plays this funny sound right here.
Okay, that's not enough evidence.
Jonathan was illegally selling U.S. information to the Soviets.
Excuse me, I think that's you, sir, not me.
No, it was you.
Okay.
It was you.
That's just somebody saying I
Which step
did.
player test?
Okay.
Don't touch U.S. information!
And the Soviets had the KGB.
Hello, my good sir. Now, I heard you've been doing illegal things in the state. You were reading an illegal book. Yes, you were. You were reading an anti-communist Soviet book. Anti-Soviet book. This book. You were reading this book. Have you been reading this book?
Yes.
Alright, TV. You're good to go. You can... Here.
Thank you.
Have that book there. Right. Thank you for your time, sir. Goodbye.
But the Soviets were not just leading in spyware, they were also leading everywhere else. Like in the space race with the Sputnik I. They had also gotten the first person into space. But at the same time, there also seemed to be a missile gap in the Soviets' favor. This made a huge panic in the US. Things would get even worse when the Soviets and US upgraded from atomic bombs to hydrogen bombs, which were much bigger. Things got even worse when West Germany was allowed to join NATO, which incentivized Khrushchev to create the Warsaw Pact, including every Eastern Bloc member except for Albania and Yugoslavia. Anyways, the US now had another election, and for their election, they elected John F. Kennedy to be their president. Anyways, back in Berlin, the West was doing so so much better than the East. The East was still dilapidated and mostly destroyed from World War II, and the West, they were doing so much better than the East. And that's why hundreds of people were moving from the West to the East, because there was no wall dividing them at the time. But the East did not like this because they were losing workers, so they had a plan, and this was it.
We're going to build a wall. It's going to be built.
So on August 13th, 1961, East German troops pulled up to the border between East and West Berlin and started laying barbed wire between the border, and then they built a wall between the two areas. During the time of the Berlin Wall, many would die or risk their lives trying to get past to get to family or friends. Shocked by the CIA's aggressive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, two certain men met at a bar in Mexico City. They were Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. What they did was grow two awesome beards and overthrew the government of Cuba, turning it into a communist nation. Anyways, back in the US, they were not too happy about those two taking over Cuba, so they took in Cuban exiles and trained them to fight for an invasion of Cuba. But at the last second, they removed the US soldiers from the invasion, leading the US to an embarrassing loss at the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Now, Fidel Castro, he was still unhappy because he thought that the US was still going to try and kill him. So he teamed up with Nikita Khrushchev to get support against the US. And Nikita Khrushchev sent missiles to Cuba. Now, the US was able to figure this out in a satellite image that I imagine looked like this. But the US, either way, did not want missiles in their backyard. So, they made a naval blockade blocking all Soviet ships from going to Cuba, and any ships that did not comply would be sunk. And then for the first time in history, the US moved to DEFCON 2. DEFCON 1 and we're all dead. And then the day before the US was supposed to set the date and time for the invasion, Nikita Khrushchev called John F. Kennedy and said, "Hey, you know, if you removed your missiles from Turkey, we would remove ours from Cuba?" And then Kennedy said, "Yeah, that sounds good." It was a little more complicated than that. But anyways, back in the United States of America, they were a changing nation. This had become this. And this had become this. And MLK was doing protests, and John F. Kennedy went for a drive in Dallas, Texas. And MAD was created, which is mutually assured destruction. Basically, if they thought it was going to destroy the world, they wouldn't do it. And then this guy, Leonid Brezhnev, became leader of the Soviet Union. Anyways, in this Asian country called Vietnam, they were having a civil war. Communist versus anti-communist. The Korean War all over again. Anyways, our president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was deciding on whether to send in the troops or not. See, what he feared was the domino effect. If Vietnam fell, would Cambodia, Laos, Thailand also fall as well? So what the US ended up doing with that was sending in the troops. But Vietnam was unlike any war the US had ever fought in before. You see, it was in a jungle. So that meant using loud aerial vehicles, which meant being spotted by the enemy easily. The Viet Cong also set up traps for the US soldier, which used large spikes to pierce the skin. They also lived in large tunnel systems under the ground. So the US started using chemicals to fight this war, specifically napalm, which was very deadly. Also, all of this was put on live TV for US citizens to watch back at their home, which caused mass protests back in the US against the Vietnam War. They did not want to be in that war anymore. So in the 1968 election, LBJ was replaced by Law and Order candidate Richard Nixon. And when he became president, he immediately took the US troops out of Vietnam, which led the Viet Cong to win the war 2 years later, uniting Vietnam. By this point in the Cold War, the USSR was still spending a lot of money on their military, and none on their people, and they had nothing to show for it. They were standing in bread lines all day. And either way, they were losing the space race now, because the US had just landed on the moon. But either way, the US was also using a lot of money to fight the Soviet Union. And their economies were doing super bad at this time, so they both needed to really reduce spending in order to save both their economies. But how are they going to reduce spending? Well, they were going to use one word: détente, or a time of relaxed tensions. Nixon would become the first president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev would return the favor a year later. And US relationship with China was improving through ping-pong diplomacy, which is where each other's table tennis teams would visit each other's countries to play. Nixon even visited China in 1972.
Many lives, of course, were lost in building it because there was no machinery or equipment at the time. It had to all be done by hand. But under the circumstances, it is a certainly symbol of what China in the past has been and what China in the future can become.
But turns out back home in America, Nixon was breaking a bunch of laws he wasn't supposed to by spying on the Democratic Party's headquarters and tapping into what they were saying. After that, Nixon was forced to resign, and Gerald Ford would become president. The first thing he did as president was pardon Nixon. After that, Democratic candidate Jimmy Carter was elected president in the 1976 election. And one of the first things he did as president was sign the SALT II with Brezhnev. But that wasn't to say there wasn't any tension between these two, because Europe just had the Euro missile crisis, and then the Soviet Union decided they wanted their own Vietnam. After that, Jimmy Carter would only end up going for one term. And in the 1980 election, they elected California Governor Ronald Reagan to be U.S. president. Now, he did not like that the USSR was breaking human civil rights acts, so he made a speech where he called them an evil empire. He also wanted to renew the arms race by using computing and lasers. Then Ronald Reagan also created the Space Defense Initiative, which was really expensive, but it was also called Star Wars, so that's pretty cool. But then tension started to grow between the PRC and the USSR, causing them to break ties in the Sino-Soviet split. But then back in the USSR, Brezhnev got really old and died and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, who was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, who was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the real game changer for the USSR. He immediately took a stand of openness and restructuring of the government, which was completely unheard of from past Soviet leaders. He also allowed the news to talk about whatever they wanted to. He even starred in a Pizza Hut commercial, which I have right here.
Это Горбачев. Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть Писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.
After that, Reagan and Gorbachev would become such good friends to the point where Gorbachev attended Reagan's funeral in 2004 in DC. But that didn't stop Reagan from hating communism. And on June 12, 1987, Reagan would give his Tear Down This Wall speech, which we actually have a video for, so we are going to play that now.
General Secretary Roosevelt, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek globalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And so 2 years later, on November 4th, 1989, 500,000 protesters gathered in the streets of East Berlin to protest about that wall. The crowd would continue to grow for the next 5 days until...
Also Privatreisen nach dem Ausland können ohne Vorliegen von Voraussetzungen, Reiseanlässe und Verwandtschaftsverhältnisse beantragt werden. Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
But turns out during that speech, he actually did make a mistake because the border wasn't supposed to open until the next day. But all the protesters were let through because the checkpoint crossing guards did not want to deal with all that trouble. And then East and West Berlin were finally connected. Then Bulgaria moved towards having elections. Czechoslovakia had the peaceful Velvet Revolution, and Romania would go through a very violent revolution in which they killed their leader and his wife on live TV. After that, the US would just decide to stay out of Soviet and Eastern European politics. Anyways, Gorbachev had given the USSR political freedom, which meant that the USSR's citizens could vote for a political leader. And they voted for a bunch of people, but one specific guy was Boris Yeltsin, who became leader of the Soviet Republic of Russia. Anyways, this is important because Russia is the biggest and most important state in the USSR. Anyways, let's get to how the USSR would break apart into all its new republics it has today. So these communist hardliners were kind of annoyed with what Gorbachev was doing with the Soviet Union, so they kidnapped him, and Yeltsin had to come and save Gorbachev by using his tanks to give him up. Now during that time, Boris Yeltsin teamed up with Belarus and Ukraine to split up the Soviet Union and create many different new democratic republics. And then, after that, the US would become the sole superpower of the world and rule everything until about 10 years later.